I'd like to welcome Henry Mintzberg to our program. We've been running here in Brazil for the last day or so. Along with Omar and Dora, we're delighted to have Henry Mintzberg, one of our colleagues at McGill University, join the program and talk about some of his latest thinking. Henry, you've been talking a lot about companies as communities, kind of taking a different view than a lot of other management thinkers. What brought this focus on as corporations or firms as communities?
Well, I think if I go back to the earliest work I did, that was always there, but not in that sense. To me, I've always viewed companies as places where if they function effectively, people get engaged. They're part of it, they feel part of it, they feel they belong to it. They don't feel this sense of out the door if we don't quite make our numbers on the stock exchange in the next quarter. So I've always seen effective organizations as strong communities. I just didn't use the term. And then about, 10 years ago, I started talking about what I call community ship, which is just not a word in English, but it's like leadership. And I think we need to shift from too much emphasis on leadership to more emphasis on community ship. The idea of building companies where people feel they belong. And when they do, people want to go to work feeling good. They want to go to work feeling they're doing something important, and they want to go to work feeling respected. And when they do, they work much harder.
Do you think that in North America particularly, we focus on the CEO, the leader, too much, and we're neglecting something in doing that?
Yeah, the United States in particular is absolutely obsessed with leadership. It's just, I think that the less leadership they get, the more they talk about leadership. It's this kind of yearning for somebody to come in and save us. And maybe that somebody is ourselves. Maybe the person who's going to save us is each of us together, not independently, but together, people working together to do it. Sure, people respond to leadership, and sure, they like people who energize them. But essentially, a lot of the charismatic leaders are just not ordinary, but they're just likable people who we can relate to, and therefore we energize ourselves.
Do you think we take too much of a top-down approach when we look at things, particularly like changing an organization? Do we take too much of a top-down approach?
Yeah, absolutely. There are lots of cases where a very good leader comes in and changes an organization, or more likely creates an organization, because new firms, startups, entrepreneurial companies are typically created by very strong people who build teams around themselves and often very sort of self-centered in a way, like a Steve Jobs. There's no question of that. But established organizations, good leaders of established organizations, are often people who work in harmony with the culture, with the people there, and so on. And let's face it, if an organization gets better, the chief executive might be a factor. The weather can be a factor. If you're an agricultural business and the weather's good, that could make all the difference too. Competition can be a factor in the sense of your competitors getting better or getting worse. So there's all kinds of factors that drive organizations. Leadership is one of them, but only one of them. There are a lot of others, and we've so obsessed about leadership that we've downplayed the other factors like communityship. If you look at one of the most popular models of change, of transformation in organizations, it's from John Cotter, and there's a PowerPoint that shows it. And if you read down those points, establish a sense of urgency, forming a powerful guiding coalition, creating a vision, communicating the vision, empowering others, and so on, it's all focused on the top. It's all focused on the leadership. Every bit of it, as if you can only change an organization from there. Well, IKEA, the famous furniture chain, changed dramatically when they decided that they would sell their furniture disassembled so that people could get it in their cars and take it home. Well, how did that come to be? Well, it came to be because a worker tried to put a table in his car and it didn't fit, so he took the legs off. And then somebody said, well, gee, if we have to take the legs off, maybe our customers do too. That's how companies change. They change when ideas come up, and companies that have healthy cultures encourage their people to think that way and listen to the ideas that come up that way and help to promote things. So this idea that the guiding coalition and guiding vision and all this stuff is, I just get tired of it. Sure, it's important to have a guiding vision, but the guiding vision often grows out of a lot of debate and discussion within the company and doesn't come immaculately conceived like Jesus did to, to the chief executive. Even the word top, what's top about top management? Like top up there somewhere? I mean, what's top about top? Top salary, yes, often much too top, because people who accept those big bonuses are not leaders. If you accept to be paid 500 times as much as your workers, which is now the average in the United States, you're not a leader. You're sending signals out that you're 500 times more important than anybody else. Top of the building, yeah, big deal. It means if you're top of the building, it means you're the farthest from the ground where products are made and customers are met and things happen. So we got to get rid of this idea of top management. Start getting connecting. We got to connect management with what's going on in the organization.
One of the key ideas that you brought to the world is emergent strategy. And emergent strategy really is saying that it comes from not just from the top, but throughout the organization. How would you see emergent strategy working, maybe not just the Brazilian context, but how does it work in companies that you've seen?
Well, emergent strategy can actually come from anybody, including the so-called top manager. The idea of emergent strategy is that it's a learning process, that strategies aren't deliberate. You think great thoughts and then you implement them. Strategies emerge out of trying things, testing things, doing things, and gradually you learn your way into a strategy. So when Procter & Gamble developed Pampers, the disposable diapers, which became their biggest product, they never dreamed that people would use it at home. They introduced it as a product for traveling because people didn't want to travel with cloth diapers and all the dirty things and so on. And to their surprise, they discovered that people wanted to use it at home. So what I'm saying is we learn. That's how strategies develop. We learn. We don't just sit there in these very stilted meetings, these strategic planning meetings, and sort of magically develop strategies. I've never been to a discussion of the strengths and weaknesses of a company as a feeding into strategy that was remotely interesting. We're sitting there in maybe a car company and saying, well, we know how to make engines. Well, thank you, that's really interesting. Our strength is making engines, good idea. Companies have to learn from their successes and failures, which means they have to articulate and think about their successes and failures, but more importantly, they have to have a lot of successes and failures so they can learn from them. Strategy is about learning.
So Henry, one of the central things we're talking about today is the company as a community. What are some of the important points you want to make there?
Well, it's a sense of how you view the organization. With all the downsizing and casual firing and all that that's so common in particularly the Anglo-Saxon countries, not so much Canada, somewhat, but the US and Britain particularly, we view companies as collections of human resources. Human resources is the worst term we ever came up with. I'm not a human resource. I'm a human being. And companies are collections of human beings. Easy come, easy go, fire them, hire them. Companies are communities of human beings, not collections of human resources. And they're collaborative places where people work with each other. There's not this separation between management and leadership where the leaders sit on top and the managers are doing the dirty work. It's the leaders have to manage and managers have to lead. They're the same people. It's all part of the same thing. So that's how companies develop. And there's a slide about that called the company as community, and then there's another one called renewing community. And because a lot of companies had strong sense of community, and they lose it when they so overemphasize control systems and overemphasize leadership and overemphasize bonuses to executives, and all that gets away from people engaging themselves. So how do you, usually there's something remaining. People care about the company no matter how they've been kicked around. And that has to be reunited or reignited like a fire to bring back the fire. And that means recognizing that people all over the company can come up with good ideas if they feel they're part of it, if they feel that it respects them, and then they respect it, and then they develop that, and then you develop a culture of trust, of openness, of those kinds of things, and then it becomes infectious. It it moves throughout the company, and all that is sort of discussed briefly on the PowerPoint called Renewing Community.
Some people, some managers would think people are going to try to cheat, they're trying to take away from you, they're lazy effectively. Do you see that people are much more positive than that by and large?
Well, look, there are lazy people and there are not lazy people, obviously. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you start with the assumption that people are lazy, lo and behold, they'll be lazy. If you start with the assumption that people are energetic, you're more likely to bring out the energy in at least some of those people. You know, one of the things I should add, which I didn't get into, is I find there's a very strong sense of community in Brazil. That's why I like the place. It's one of the reasons I like it. I'm amazed at the whole way in which Brazil dealt with the HIV/AIDS crisis, the way people do budgeting in Porto Alegre, the massive initiative of the use of bioenergy and so on, fuels and so on. There's so many interesting, fascinating social initiatives in Brazil which are significantly community-based. What I find fascinating about the Brazilian people is that they're a why not people. I've never met more of a why not people. Some people say why. You say, how about this idea? And they say why. Like, why should we do that? Why should we bother? Yeah. These are the bureaucrats. Brazilians tend to be why not people. Yeah, what the hell, sure, try anything. We'll break a branch. I know there's an expression in Portuguese about breaking a branch, finding your way through. And the Brazilians are very much that kind of flexible, adaptable people. Not all of them. I've met bureaucrats in Brazil too, believe me. But there's that sense. A Brazilian woman in Montreal, living in Montreal now, she says, when we get together in Montreal with our friends, we have to figure out where we're going, what restaurant, make a reservation, what movie, negotiation, all that. She says, in Brazil, we just get together and we say, what do we feel like doing? It's not a bad way of doing things for companies, at least if you want creativity. I mean, you obviously have to produce products and do things very organized, but that sense of, let's work it out, let's figure it out.
It's interesting, the IMPM, which you and other colleagues started a number of years ago now, used to go to France, China, Japan, and Korea. One of the countries, along with China, that you're moving to is Brazil. Just curious, why did you choose to bring the IMPM every year to Brazil?
Well, that's part of the reason, the things I just said. It's also that I think Brazil is the most interesting of the BRIC countries. Certainly Russia's not particularly interesting in many respects. But Brazil has that kind of open culture. And Brazil brings the three sectors of society together, sometimes in very interesting ways. In other words, it has much stronger government, much more respect for government than Americans or Brits do. Okay? It's got strong private sector, and it's got a very strong community, what I call plural sector, public-private plural. And so it's a fascinating place in that regard, and I think we should be there. We're actually in BIC. We're not in Russia, but we run a module in India, a module in China, and a module in Brazil, in Rio. And not incidentally, Rio for me is the most spectacular city in the world, and it's nice to go to Rio too. That's not the reason. It may be the reason we went to Rio rather than Sao Paulo. It's not the reason we went to Brazil, but it didn't hurt.
So Henry, you've written about heroic versus engaging management. We have some of the slides there. Maybe you could share some of your thoughts about that.
As I said earlier, I'm not a big fan of heroic leadership, the great one who rides in on the white horse and save everything. Usually they fall straight into a black hole, and you never, with the white horse in the black hole, and you never see them anymore. I think what we need is engaging management. I think we need people who are in managerial positions who engage themselves deeply in the company. They believe in it. They haven't fled into the company to do it for a few years. They believe in the company, and then they engage other people by their energy, by their enthusiasm. So what these slides do is they compare kind of those two approaches, one of which on the left in blue I think is dominant in the United States today, although not in, there are lots of good companies in the United States where it's not. And the other is what I think leads to more effective organization. So for example, the first point, leaders are important. people apart from, you know, the people who merely develop products and services, whereas managers are important to the extent that they help other people to be important. And the next slide is the higher up these leaders go, the more important they become. The CEO is the company. Well, that's nonsense. That's nonsense. An organization is an interacting network. Managers aren't on top, leaders aren't on top, they're everywhere. And then about strategy, we talked about deliberate and emergent strategies on the next slide. To lead is to make decisions and allocate resources, including those human resources. Leading thus means calculating based on facts from reports. Very analytic, very technocratic, compared with to managers that bring out the energy that exists with people, you know. Leadership is leadership is thrust upon those who thrust their will on others. So it's as if the board has designated you chief executive, therefore you're a leader. Wow, that's nonsense. You're a leader because people want to be led by you, because people believe in you, not because the board designates you. We have too many so-called leaders who are what's called kiss up and kick down kind of leaders. They kiss people who are more influential than them and kick people who are beneath them. Leadership is a sacred trust earned from those people. You're a leader because people really feel you're a leader. And frankly, I don't think those leaders are exotic, you know, sometimes they are, but usually they're just people you like. That's all. Obama's kind of a likable guy, you know. I don't think Romney was a very likable guy in the same respect. Nothing to do with left or right or conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat. I think Obama's just my feeling before that election was the Americans like likable people. Reagan was a likable guy. Bush had that kind of front, although he was kind of empty. But Obama had that sense, and Reagan, not Reagan, but
Bush?
Who ran against Obama this time?
Romney.
Yeah, Romney sort of had this kind of feeling that we didn't like the guy particularly.
Do you think there's a lot of family firms in Brazil? Do you think family firms are a little bit better in some ways, or could be, than firms where a CEO comes in for a couple of years and then heads out?
Well, it's easier to generate that kind of engagement often because the family might view the company as a sacred trust, and when other generations take over, they have a feeling that, you know, this company is important, our workers are important to us, they're part of our family in a sense, and so that's something you can use to create community, and it's not coincidental that a lot of the strongest feelings of communities and companies are in family companies. The danger and the difficulty is succession, because the fact that a father was a brilliant entrepreneur doesn't automatically make the son a brilliant entrepreneur. I think it's kind of Russian roulette with 5 bullets. You know, in Russian roulette you have 1 bullet and 5 chances you won't get killed. In family succession, you have 5 bullets and 5 chances you'll get killed, and 1 that you won't. In other words, you've got to be very careful about succession in family companies.
Henry, you have a new pamphlet, Rebalancing Society. Some of your latest thinking. What are some of the key points you're making there?
Well, it's an electronic, I call it an electronic pamphlet. It's up on the introduction is up on my site on mintzberg.org. Just a brief introduction. I'm going to put the other 50 or more pages up in a month or two, probably 2-3 months. But it's a bit some of the things we touched upon, this balance between public sector, private sector, and plural sector, that a healthy society, and I talk about Brazil explicitly as an example of that, a healthy society has strong sectors and respected sectors, and they don't do PPPs so much, they do PPPs. They do relationships of public, private, and plural organizations. That's how Brazil dealt with its HIV/AIDS crisis, for example. A lot of community groups were very involved in that. The government was involved. Community groups of gay people, community groups of people with, you know, blood, what do you call it?
Donors.
Blood donors and so on.
Yeah.
People have to take a lot of blood. But anyway, people who need blood donations, who've contacted it, and so on. So, you know, a lot of people in the artistic community were involved. So there was very strong community involvement in that, but there was private sector and public sector activity too. So it basically talks about the fact that society is out of balance in most companies because the private sector is so dominant in the United States particularly, and the public sector has been co-opted or dominated by the private sector, the way we see it in the United States, and the plural sector is weak. And so we're out of balance, just like the communist countries were out of balance on the side of the public sector, we're out of balance on the side of the private sector. And we need to get back in. And that's why I think Brazil is an interesting example of some kind of balance that may be healthier than what we see in the Anglo-Saxon countries.
What does the plural sector bring to the table? We understand business, it brings efficiency, the market, all that sort of thing. What does the plural sector bring to the table?
Engagement, commitment, social concern, all those kinds of things. And what I mean by the plural sector are basically four things. I mean social movements, like we saw in Tahrir Square in Egypt, social initiatives, like the HIV/AIDS initiative in Brazil, organizations that are owned by nobody, like Greenpeace or like McGill University or Harvard. Nobody owns them. They're not private or public. And organizations that are owned by their members, like co-ops. And those are not quite private, or the co-ops are their business, but they're not private in the same way. They're not public. All those four institutions and organizations and movements and so on are plural in the sense that there's a very eclectic, very widespread kind of involvement, engagement.
Why a pamphlet online rather than a book? You've written a lot of books. Why did you choose to take a different path?
Because I want it to be available to everybody, but it'll be a book as well. But anybody who wants it can download it for free.